Welcome back, everybody. Our storyteller is Allan Reed. Allan was thunderstruck by love at first sight when he first laid eyes on Io by the banks of the Nile River in Khartoum. Here is Allan to tell you his story. It really was love at first sight.
Thank you. I remember that moment very vividly. It was precisely 11:30 p.m. on Saturday night, October 28, 1972. It was in the dusty lobby of the Excelsior Hotel near the banks of the River Nile in hot Khartoum, Sudan, when I first saw her. She strolled in a maxi coat, Afro puffs on either side of her beautiful face, and she walked right into my heart. Io Babalola, also known as Gwendolyn McIver, had come from New York's Harlem Hospital and stopped in Geneva, Switzerland at the end of October to meet with the Director of Health for the World Council of Churches, hence the Mexico. And she had come to restore nursing services in southern Sudan at the end of the First Civil War. Both of us had been hired by Church World Service and seconded to the Commission for Relief and Rehabilitation of Sudan Council of Churches. But Io was the first African American hired by CWS to come to Sudan. I want to tell you that I'm very grateful for the inefficiency of the Sudanese government. And I'll explain how. I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia. I was a teacher, and while I was in Gambela, the western part of Ethiopia, I opened up a refugee hostel for southern Sudanese who came to that part of Ethiopia seeking refuge from the first long civil war where more than 1 million people had died since 1955. When I finished my Peace Corps service, I had opened up a hostel so southern Sudanese could go to the school where I was teaching. I was approached by the Anyanya movement. The Anyanya Rebellion was the African liberation movement fighting for an independent black African southern Sudan from the Arab North. And they asked me to come in, invited me in as the first foreign witness to try and get some publicity for the movement, for the struggle they were going through, and to find some humanitarian assistance. So I ended up spending 10 months walking with the Anyanya rebels in the bush in southern Sudan. I made a film for NBC TV and did research on how to start a cross-border relief program and frequently spoke on the BBC. NBC really liked the film that I made. It was shown on a program called First Tuesday, which was similar to CBS's 60 Minutes. And NBC liked the film so much, they said, let's do another one. Let's make another film in Africa. And if it turns out to be as good as this film on Sudan, we don't have an Africa correspondent, and that job could be yours. So I got into an argument with NBC. They wanted me to make a film about Peace Corps in Africa. I love the Peace Corps. But that's really an American story. And I wanted to bring Julius Nyereri's story, the heroic first president of Tanzania, to display him to an American television audience. And we argued back and forth. NBC wanted Peace Corps, I wanted Nyerere. But before we could resolve that, there were movements towards peace in Sudan. And so I told NBC I'd rather work for peace in Sudan. And so I came to restore the schools and clinics that were destroyed during the war and to help resettle refugees. And that's the smartest decision I ever made. By saying no to NBC and yes to Sudan, I met Io. Io came, and when she arrived in Khartoum, I had gotten there before her. When I arrived in Khartoum, the immigration authorities at the airport said, Mr. Reed, you're persona non grata. You did the film, you spoke on the BBC, you wrote a lot of articles critical. You're not welcome in this country. You have two choices. You can either get on this plane and go back to Europe, or you can wait for the next plane to come up from East Africa and go back to Europe that way. But they let me make one telephone call. So I called Bonamalawa, who was the Southern Sudanese Minister of Information in the Sudanese government. And he came to the airport and he told the immigration authorities that the blacklist was no longer valid. The war's over. And so they let me enter Sudan. But it took them a month to allow me to transfer from the north to the south, where my assignment was. And I was still waiting in Khartoum when I arrived. The Ministry of Health in Southern Sudan was so eager for her to get to Juba, the capital of Southern Sudan, that when she got to Khartoum, that's when they realized they had forgotten to even think about where she was going to live in this war-torn capital. And it took them a month to organize a tent. And so we were stuck in the same hotel while the Sudanese took their sweet time to let me go down to the south and arrange for Io to find housing. Now, Io was taken aback by Khartoum. She had expected she was coming to tropical Africa. Southern Sudan is, but Khartoum is an Arab city. And she was not so pleased with some of the attitudes and behavior that she saw in the north. But I told her, just reserve your judgment, wait till you get to Southern Sudan. So we took advantage of finding out the best of Khartoum and to get to know each other during our month together in Khartoum. Finally, she went to Juba, and I went to Wau, right down the road from Ye in Southern Sudan. And she came to visit me in Wau at Christmas time. I went to Juba to visit her. And our love blossomed. There are no telephones, there's no internet, there wasn't even any postal services. So I would send love letters to Io in Juba with truck drivers who plied their wares on the dusty roads, the 500 miles between Wau and Juba. And she would send responses back wrapped around this delicious banana bread that she made. Io was the most wonderful woman I'd ever met. She was beautiful. She was really smart about everything. She was generous. She was warm. She was spiritually together. And I was falling deeply in love. But then, after 1 year, she left Juba. She went to Kenya and became the director of nurses of the Northern Frontier District along the Ethiopian border. And I was distraught and really sad that she had left Sudan. So when I finished my time in Sudan in 1974, I went to Kenya to see Io. And just at that moment, we learned that her mother in New York and my father in California were critically ill. And so we realized we had to come back to the United States. I decided to ask Io, when we go back to the US, why don't we live together? And she made it very clear that under no circumstances would there be any shacking up. Well, I thought, this was just after the 1960s. Living together was just as much of a commitment to me. But Io schooled me, that's not the way it is. So we were walking in Nairobi and passing a jewelry store. So I said, honey, you want a ring? And she looked at me like I was offering her a bauble from a Cracker Jack box. And I said, no, a real ring. And that's the feeble way that I proposed. So we went back to the States. In New York, she went to see her mother in the hospital. And she told her that she'd come back from Africa, and now she was engaged. And as she described me, without mentioning my race, her mother was very perceptive, and she started asking her some questions. Now, Io had never dated a white American. She had mostly dated Africans. And finally, her mother asked her, is your fiancé white? And Io said, yes. She affirmed that. And her mother said, you've got to be the only black woman I know who's gone all the way to Africa to find a white man. So the next day, Io brought me to meet her mother. And I was privileged to meet the mother of the woman I love. and we actually hit it off very well. 2 years and 2 months later, to the day, on December 28, 1974, Aya and I were married at the Holy Family Catholic Church in New York City, across the street from the United Nations. Our love has taken us around the world. We've lived in 8 countries throughout Africa. We've also lived in Russia, Sri Lanka, Japan, Bosnia, and now we're residents in Finland. We have 4 wonderful children, 3 grandchildren, and 3 of our kids have really done it right. Their proposals involve bended knee, romantic settings, and Aya always reminds me, that's not the way you did it. So let me make this right. I have loved you for 43 years and more. Will you still be mine for another few precious decades?
Why not?